This is the way it's going to run this morning. My brother David and I are going to have a debate, and I'm going to present Thucydides' point of view. Okay, I'm going to try to explain what that point of view is. But essentially, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present it as pro-democracy. Okay, as somebody who was essentially enthusiastic about this new form of government that the Athenians had invented. All right, and then David is going to present Plato's view, and he's going to criticize democracy. So we're going to debate. So I get to start. I get to start for a very simple reason, because I'm older. Okay, This is, for me, this is crucial, okay? These are the three people we're going to be talking about, all right? You read him. But what he was really saying is that it was that fellow's funeral oration that he is giving to us, right? After the first year of the war, as you read, the first year of the war, the Athenians give a public funeral for the war dead. They honor them for what they've sacrificed for the city, right? And you read the funeral oration of Pericles. That oration is to my mind, certainly, the most extraordinary, exciting statement about democracy that I've ever read. It's bursting with this kind of excitement that this is a wonderful system of government under which to live. Athens is a very exciting people. We are the school of all of Greece. And the Greeks had no doubt about it. In their world, they were the school of the entire Mediterranean, okay? People would come, strangers would come to them and be amazed, because everything was happening in this place, all right? The three tragedians that you probably read in school were producing tragedies. History is invented in this generation with Herodotus and then Thucydides, and they're giving public lectures in the Agora. Philosophy is invented here. Philosophers from the entire Greek world are assembling in Athens to talk in the streets about these wonderful new ideas they have. Okay, this is an amazing place. Okay, the first beginnings of medical science are happening here. Everything is going on in this tiny little city of about 30,000 people. Can you imagine? All right, and we're still amazed at this place. All right, they also are building the Acropolis. Have you all visited the Acropolis? Some of you visited the Acropolis, right? You've certainly seen pictures of it. Well, it was all built within about a 20-year period at the end of this fellow Pericles' lifetime. Okay, the construction got going in the 450s in a big way, and it was being completed as he was speaking his funeral oration, and the Athenians, the Greeks, the people in the ancient Mediterranean had never seen such a thing. Well, it wasn't quite as big as Egypt. But Herodotus talks about that, all right? He talks about how amazing Egypt is, okay? So anyway, that's what's going on. And so Thucydides, you read two things by him, and he is born. You notice there's an interesting thing about dates here. There's about 34, 35 years between each of these guys. So the ancient Greeks thought 33 years was the average age of a generation, the gap between generations. So they were exactly in 3 different generations, okay? Grandfather, father, baby, okay? All right? Basically, that's the way it works, all right? So he is writing as a, a middle-aged man about this fellow Pericles. Obviously, he admires him, right? And he even when he becomes disillusioned. Remember the second reading you read about democracy? And this is something that Thucydides seems to have written at the end of this war which Athens lost. And he has become disillusioned. And he says, well, the only reason democracy worked really was so wonderful under Pericles is because Pericles was able to control it. Okay, that he was able to make sure it worked. Democracy needs leaders, and it needs good leaders in order for it to work. Okay, and that we'll come back to. And then you have Plato. Now Plato was a young aristocrat, and he was a student of Socrates, who was a great admirer of Socrates. Okay, who was talking, who was philosophizing in Athens at this time, and he tended to have a group of students and admirers around him who were the sort of the sons of the well-to-do in Athens. They were kind of an aristocratic group of people, and Plato is clearly disillusioned with democracy. But there's something I want us to pay a little attention to here. I'm going to say that Thucydides' judgment of democracy in Athens is clearly more meaningful, more accurate than Plato's. All right? Why do I say that? I say that largely because of these crucial years, what I call them, the years 429 to 411. Those are the years between the death of Pericles and this year 411, 410, in which there was a crisis in the Athenian democracy. The thing that caused that crisis was that Athens had been quite successful in an early war against Sparta and her Peloponnesian allies. Athens had been fairly successful and had established a fairly good peace with Sparta. And it came unraveled. And the reason it came unraveled is that Athens was ambitious. It was aggressive, and it wanted to conquer Sicily. Sicily at the time was very wealthy in grain, particularly, and the Greek world was well established in Italy and Sicily, in the Western Mediterranean, and Athens' idea was to be able to control that part of the Greek world by conquering its most powerful city, Syracuse. So in 415, that is 4 years before this crisis year, they sent out an expedition to conquer Syracuse. And some of you know this story, I'm sure. What happened is that it was a disaster. And in your second reading of Thucydides, he talks about why it might have been a disaster. He says, I don't know if you remember that, he says it actually could have been successful. It wasn't in and of itself, doomed as an expedition. But the problem was that there were, I think in your readings it uses the word cabals. There were factions, there was jealousies at home that caused this military expedition to be a disaster. Specifically, what had happened is no sooner had they sent off this expedition, whose leading strategist in general was this guy named Alcibiades. No sooner had they sent it off when they discovered that Alcibiades and his sort of aristocratic friends had partied a little excessively the night before they left, and had had knocked the heads off some statues. They had gotten a little out of control, these guys, and so they decided they were going to get revenge and sent a ship after the expedition in order to call Alcibiades back. That, of course, was a disaster. That's like you're sending your general, your strategist, off to a war, and then a month later, you jerk them out of the field, okay? And you leave somebody in charge who actually was not in favor of going on the expedition in the first place, okay? So it ended up being a disaster. As a result of that disaster, in the year 411, there was an attempted coup by an aristocratic faction in Athens, people who basically thought that democracy doesn't work because some people, namely us, those of us here in this room, we are more capable of making decisions than all the people out there. That's essentially what happened. They were in the assembly, these 400 people, and they said, I think we should be running things instead of the people. Okay, and so they had this sort of attempted aristocratic reform of the government. That didn't work. The democracy was reestablished after 410, but the war wore on, and it ended up becoming a disaster because this fellow Alcibiades ended up working for the king of Persia and the Spartans, and he became a kind of mercenary general, and Persia got really excited and involved in this, and it started helping Sparta. And as you probably know, these Greek city-states were nothing compared to Persia. I mean, Persia was vastly wealthy and had many more soldiers and ships than the Greeks could possibly muster. And Athens ended up losing this war disastrously. The Sparta ended up tearing down Athenian defenses at the end of this century. And for a very brief period of time, there was a government of 30 tyrants. They called them the 30 tyrants, who controlled Athens, and they essentially worked for Sparta. There was, in the year after this century, in 399, the democracy took over again, and they held a long series of trials in which they got revenge on all the people who had collaborated with these 30 tyrants. This should remind you of, things that happened, for example, in Europe after the end of the Second World War. You had collaborators, and then you had revenge trials against collaborators and that sort of thing, okay? Things that happened in European democracies at the end of the Second World War. So that's what happened, all right? And in that year, one of these trials was against Socrates, Plato's teacher. And this, I think you all know about, right? What was the result of that trial? He died, right? He was told, he was found guilty, and then he was told to pay a fine, right? It was actually it was a token fine, and because he believed he was not guilty, and that he actually had given great benefit to the state, he refused to pay the fine, at which point they applied the death penalty, and he had to drink hemlock, okay? So at that point, Socrates, of course, becomes a martyr, right? And that's the way we've viewed him ever since. He's a martyr, and the bad guy is democracy at that point, okay? So all that for me is the explanation why I think Thucydides, you see, Thucydides knew democracy in its heyday. It knew democracy in the middle of this century, in Athens, and he describes it in Pericles' words in the funeral oration. What is it? It's a society in which we all are engaged, in which we all know that we can participate. We're all equal before the law. Very important part, okay? Without equality before the law, democracy cannot exist. It's a sham. Democracy began in Athens when laws were published. Think about how important that is. A law is published. It's written down in the marketplace. They had these great tablets in which all the laws are written down. So nobody can tell you, oh, you just broke the law. Okay? Because you can say, hey, wait a second. The law's written down. Which law did I break? No, I didn't do that. Okay? And besides, there's a law that says you can't just jerk me off to prison because you said I broke the law. Okay? So having the law written down is absolutely crucial to democracy, right? And what kind of society does it produce? It produces an open society and an energetic society. That's what the funeral oration tells us, right? We don't give our neighbors grim looks because they do things differently than we do, it says. All right? What do we call that? Tolerance, right? We tolerate different beliefs. We tolerate different manners in a democracy, right? And what the other thing it does, it produces great energy because everybody gets involved and everybody knows they have a piece of the action. They can be involved. And so what it does is it makes us, as the funeral oration says, makes us the school of all Greece. It makes us lovers of beauty without weakness. Also, we are an open society. We don't have to hide all our military secrets. Okay, we're an open society. Anybody can walk anywhere, can take pictures, can talk to us, can attend our assembly, can attend the meetings of our councils, can find out what we're planning, what we think of everybody, can read our newspapers. You can write anything, say anything. Okay, that doesn't make us weaker because we're ready to meet all adversity, okay? We don't live in fear. That's what the funeral oration says, right? It's pretty wonderful. Didn't turn out so good in this century, but it's pretty wonderful, right? So, now you get Mr. Critic here. It's up to you, David.
Thank you, Scott, for setting the table.
You need to get
Well, now you've heard about the idea of democracy, I'm going to give you the facts. All right? It's a lovely idea, and no one would find any fault in the funeral oration. If we could all live in a society like that perpetually, we'd all be very happy. But as Scott has pointed out, even that brief history of democracy in the 5th century turned out to be a disaster. And it was the disaster that caused Plato to react the way he did to it, because he saw this fantastic experiment fail spectacularly. Why? Because of horrific decision-making on the part of the demos, the people. It became what our forefathers in the United States feared most, and they used the word a mobocracy. The mob, the rabble. That's us in this room, the rabble, okay? Getting emotionally excited about something and decided we're going to send our army off to Iraq, fix things over there. We're going to send our army off to Afghanistan, fix things over there. That's what the demos does. The people get really excited, get all heated up, make a stupid decision that doesn't only affect the people, but it affects the world around them. Now, I want to talk about Plato's criticism of democracy. What I've done here is just tried to outline for you the very specific points that you read in the dialogue. Plato's, he writes a series of dialogues. His conversations are between Socrates, his teacher, and the students. And sometimes you might find these conversations a little long and tedious, but if you follow them carefully, you'll see a really interesting sort of the way his mind works. And that's also great teaching, the kind of teaching that goes on in a university like this. The translation that you read was Benjamin Jowett's translation. Jowett was a master at Balliol College, this college, in the 19th century, and was the great translator of Plato up until recently. So there's a lot of, I wanted you to read that translation because I wanted we're sort of sitting in his space right now and get a feel for what has gone on here for centuries. But Plato's critique of democracy isn't based upon theory. This is the point I want to emphasize with you. He lived through this whole cycle which Scott was talking about. He watched this great experiment unravel and destroy Athens. And as I go through these points, as Scott has said, be looking at the points I'm missing. If I'm missing points, let's point those out, okay? But I want you to think about these points. You're young people. Most of you growing up in democracies. Here are the problems with democracy, according to Plato. Not only does it value money over virtue, but it encourages citizens to squander their wealth on pleasure, luxury, and idleness. As Scott has already pointed out, one of Plato's basic critique of democracy, the underlying critique is democracy over time destroys people. It weakens people. This is a stunning criticism and quite ironic, isn't it? Because democracy, we think of it as something, as Scott has said, that liberates people, that frees people, that empowers people. But democracy, like every other form of government, like everything in life, it has a life cycle. It has a life cycle. And in its youth, it's open, it's curious, it's robust, it's energetic. It's like you guys. But in its old age, it's like me. Opinionated, intolerant. I've seen it all. You can't tell me anything I haven't seen, right? I've already got a point of view. But I'm just got to get in my humor here. I'm just sort of joking with you. But, because I'm more energetic than you are. But, no, everything has a life cycle. And what Plato is saying, yes, this is wonderful at the beginning. Democracy starts out full of promise, full of excitement, full of energy. But inevitably, like anything in life, it starts winding down and unraveling. And it does that because democracy as a form of government corrupts the people who are living under democracy. And the people it particularly corrupts are the young. And one reason is money. Democracy frees everybody to go after the brass ring, to accumulate as much for themselves as possible. The state will start taking more and more away from me over time in a democracy. But initially, and that's what releases all of this energy initially. I can start businesses, I can take initiatives, I'm free to do what I want to do. And so at the beginning, it's very empowering. But what's happening to these people? They are living for themselves. They're not controlled by virtue, but by their desire to acquire more power, more money, more prestige, more fame. In his last message to the United States Congress, when George Washington was begged to take a third term, which he refused to do, his last message to the Congress was a really curious message. Because essentially it was a message that said, be sure in this democracy to keep your religious institutions strong. Now, why would he say that? Because he felt that in a democracy, he had read as Plato, there needed to be a countervailing force, something else which was very important in people's lives to keep this from happening, to keep them focused on virtue, to keep them focused on helping other people besides themselves, to keep them, a restraint upon them. Second reason that Plato gives, it corrupts language, it corrupts reason, it corrupts character, institutions like the family, and society to the detriment of the young. Let me talk about this for 1 second about why this happens. If you think about democracy, if you live in a democracy, over time, again, in the life cycle of a democracy, democracy starts to influence how we think about things. For example, how do we make a decision? Do we make a decision based upon reason, or do we make a decision upon what most of the people think? Well, in democracy, democratic thinking starts to enter in, right? And you start to think, well, if most of the people think it's okay to, well, let's take a recent subject, gay marriage. I don't know how you feel about gay marriage, but we're in a democracy, right? That question is going to be decided by, in a democratic thinking, how most people feel. So that question becomes fiercely, every question of right and wrong, good and bad, becomes fiercely politicized. And one side is working to get the other side, to get more votes on their side. It's not a question of whether gay marriage is right or wrong, or whether, socially speaking, gay marriage is going to be a good thing for society. It's a question of what most people want, right? So, however you feel about that, every question like that, I mean, it's gay marriage now, what will it be? Probably be plural marriage in a few years, or something else. It doesn't matter. The question is, right, what was unthinkable a generation ago is now not only thinkable, it's the norm. It's the right thing to do, right? Democracy functions in that way. So look at language. We can all talk how we want to talk. Our language is constantly morphing, right? Because there's no norm for language. If most of the people want to say ain't, or if they want to drop the F-bomb every once in a while, or frequently, then the F-bomb becomes a standard way of talking. That's democracy. There's no controlling of that, whatever the people want. So that's his argument. It just corrupts this. It promotes a false egalitarianism. Scott said something really important, the most important thing, but it's not limited to democracy. It's being equal before the law, right? It's the rule of law. Rule of law is not unique to democracy, but it's fundamental to democracy, that everybody be equal before the law. But more than that, in a democracy, everybody has one vote, right? If you are, the most ignorant, reckless, careless person, you have as much vote as Bill Gates, who created an empire, smart guy, very altruistic, right? Has created massive wealth in his society, given tens of thousands of people work, right? He has got one vote. And so does a person who is absolutely reckless and totally selfish and doesn't care about what happens to anybody else. That's democracy. It creates this notion that we're all equal. Is that true? Only in the most religious or mystical sense are we equal. We're all unequal. So it's based upon a fundamentally stupid premise that everybody is somehow equal. Some people are much wiser than others. And this leads to this notion of, and this whole idea of tolerance is then taken to the extreme. We have to tolerate every form of behavior because we're in a democracy. And all forms of behavior, except those that are specifically outlawed, are viewed as okay. That, on the face of it, made no sense to Plato. It leads to an obsession with freedom to the neglect of other goods. other values. What would those other goods be, for example? Any ideas? What about order? What about self-restraint? What about altruism? Doing good for others. There are a lot of other goods, but in a democracy, over time, in the life cycle of the democracy, freedom becomes an end in itself. And where is this corrupting influence strongest? Among the young. They grew up in this society where their own freedom, their own personal desires are the most important things, and don't get in my way. And these ideas of, we try in a democracy, there are increasing efforts to sort of try to breed self-restraint, discipline, hard work, diligence into the young. But one of the cool things about democracy is that those who come from really privileged families, right, who have a lot of wealth, they're the ones most likely to be destroyed by the democracy, because they have the ability with their resources and everything to be free, to push back, to sort of live for themselves only. And what's often pointed out in democracy is wealth only lasts for 2 or 3 generations, because they exploit what their forefathers have built up for their family. They throw it away. And that's why those of you who come from really privileged backgrounds, what are your families doing? Trying to make sure you have a good education, trying to make sure that you have some kind of discipline or some motivation. But this obsession with freedom is what corrupts the young and corrupts democracy. Not that freedom is a bad thing, but the freedom chosen in the exclusion of all these other important things. You have to constantly choose against your freedom, right, to be here this morning in thinking. You have to choose against your freedom to fall asleep, right, to pay attention, to focus, to think, right? His other argument, it empowers the worst citizens as well as those least prepared by education and temperament to govern. In the United States, this is an easy point to make. I mean, I live in a rural area of Montana. We have a local guy who is passionate about representing our little district in the state assembly. He is an utter idiot. When he walks into the post office, everybody runs out of the post office. But no one else, we're all busy leading other lives. So no one else wants the bother of having to drive up to Helena, to the state assembly, and sit through those interminable, stupid debates that go on there, right? So this democratic government really draws into it people who are just crazy, who are the least prepared. I'll tell you something. This is a fellow who is barely educated, and guess what? He's the chairman of the State Education Committee. He has not even got an education himself, and he's got very strong opinions about it. It's like talking to Huckleberry Finn's father on the subject of education. Okay, but that's in democracy, and the United States Congress is full of people who failed at something else. And they found out, I'm going to become a congressman. And all they have to do is go out and get votes. It enriches the least productive elements in society at the expense of the most productive. One of the things that one of the candidates in the United States was scolded for is he was pointing out that in the United States now, slightly less than 1%, I mean, 51% of the people in the United States now no longer pay income taxes. 49% are paying income taxes. Well, what happens in a democracy when most of the people can go to the polls and vote to take money away from the other people, right? What happens in a democracy when that happens? It's, of course, why wouldn't I go to the poll? I'm going to vote to if I can not work or work at a really minimal level, and I can take away from what you've got, why wouldn't I, just by going to the polls to do that, why wouldn't I do that? So democracy, back to the life cycle. As the life cycle of democracy, it starts to wear down. And his final point, you've read this, is and this is the worst thing, is that democracy in itself is a good thing while it lasts, but it never lasts that long for all the reasons I pointed out. And inevitably, what happens? It leads to tyranny. Because in a democracy, this obsession with freedom, the corruption of the morals of the people, the mobocracy, the stupid decision-making, the fact that only bad people or you don't get your best leaders. Why would anyone want to lead in the United States in that democracy? The way the media just destroys any leader, right? Why would anyone want that pain? You'd have to have a real hunger for power to be involved in politics in the United States. That's the country I know, so that's the example I'm using. But the problem is as this goes down through its life cycle, what happens? Order breaks down. Tolerance, which was once so great, now it's so out of control. People are doing things that are so intolerable. A group gets together, the 30 tyrants, the oligarchs, whatever, say, this is ridiculous. This is out of control. Or horribly bad decisions are being made. We're sending the army all over the place. We're overextended. Or we're spending much more money than we have. So we have a massive debt. And now China owns us, right? I mean, it's gotten completely out of control. So now what happens? Well, now we want a strong leader. We want Mr. Putin to step in and save us from ourselves. And someone steps forward. I mean, what is going to happen to the United States when it declares bankruptcy? Or to any of these, Greece, to any of these countries that have just overwhelmingly indebted themselves. Because why? Because the people wanted to spend more money than they're willing to tax themselves for.
You have to stop talking now.
Okay? But that's my point. It comes to an end, right? It collapses in the end because democracy can't sustain itself. That's Plato's point. Okay. Thank you for indulging me.
Thank you, Plato. I just have to advise you that you've used your rebuttal time already. So,
I don't think I'll even need a rebuttal. I think the case speaks for itself. Don't you agree?
I don't think you'll have.
Don't you agree?
No. What I want us to focus on now is some of the points David's made, because I think they're absolutely crucial to the way we have to think about democracy for and against. Really, so he's touched on I think all of the really crucial points. Right. One of the things, remember, he talked about the need for restraints. He used the words right or wrong. Okay. There are things that are right, and there are things that are wrong, and we need restraints in democracy. And he quoted George Washington's farewell address to Congress. And true, you do need moral restraints in a democracy. You do. You also need leaders. You need leadership, right? You need those things. That's what Thucydides acknowledges, right? But you've got to be very, very careful when you listen to these people who tell you that you need these restraints, because they tend to go a step further, and they never explain themselves quite, because they always make the assumption that they know what's right and they know what's wrong, and they're going to make the decision for you. And so we're not going to debate it in an assembly, and we're not going to debate it in the Congress, in the legislature, where we make laws about what's right and what's wrong, and what to do about it. Because in fact there are people who say, well, I know what's right. And so what we need to do, and you notice the very important word that's always used is control. Right? Anti-democratic people love that word, control. Because for them, the world is always out of control. All right? So they need to control it. And they always make the assumption, the critics of democracy, that they know better than the people what's right and what's wrong, and therefore they need to decide. That brings us to the second very important point. David says law is not unique to democracy. But it is. That's very important. Okay, you're going to say, oh, there are laws and other kinds of government, forms of government, right? But it's not the same thing. Do you know what the beginning of law is in this country where we are now? The Magna Carta, right? What did the Magna Carta do? They were a bunch of nobles that got together, right, and said, you may be the king, but we have our privileges too, all right? And you can't step on our privileges. And we're going to write this down, right? Nobody would say that at the date of the Magna Carta, England or Great Britain had a democracy. Nobody would say that. But everybody knows, who lives in this country, or studied it, that that is the very beginning of democracy, right? Because that's what democracy does. Democratic law really is fundamentally democratic if it really is law in the proper sense. That is, it applies to everybody equally. And you have recourse before the law, not before the king, right? Or before the Pope, or for any human authority. It's law, okay? You have recourse to the law, not to a person. And that is fundamentally democratic, I would argue, okay? That notion of law. And so when the critics of democracy talk about egalitarianism and it's a nasty word, egalitarianism, and we're not equal. The only thing that democracy really says about equality and egalitarianism is that we're equal before the law. That's all that democracy really says, is that we all have equal legal rights. So nobody can say, well, I've got more rights than you do because I've got more property, or because my father was, a baron or a duke or that sort of thing, all right? That's what's really important. Final point I would make in terms of a rebuttal is that I'm going to go back to our friend Plato. I find it extraordinarily ironic that Plato talks about very accurately about the sons of privilege and wealth who become most easily corrupt, and that this system leads to tyranny. Because yes, Plato lived in a democracy. Yes, Plato was a son of privilege. Yes, Plato was wealthy. And oddly enough, Plato was a tutor to very powerful people. In particular, he was a tutor to a fellow named Dionysius in Sicily. And he with this fellow, he practiced out his ideas for better forms of government. Do you know what happened? It ended up being one of the most famous tyrannies of the ancient world. Corrupt. Under one man's rule, it became more corrupt than Athens could ever dream of becoming. All right? That's my rebuttal. Okay, Plato, let's go. I'll give you 30 seconds. Yeah, 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, first, when you're talking about who's making the decisions, you're right. I mean, whatever form of government you have, there are going to be critics, and there need to be critics. But I think Scott's point about the law and the Magna Carta was self-evident. The Magna Carta did not create democracy. Democracy didn't fly from the Magna Carta. But there were controls placed upon the leaders at that time, the hereditary leaders. And my point, Plato's point, is not to sort of defend. I mean, he would love government by the best. If you had read the whole Book 8, you would have read the best form of government for him was the government by the best people. And that's sort of what the defense of the Republic is all about. How do we identify and train the best And the interesting thing about Plato's Republic, because he saw this danger, is the best had to live without. The best lived like a bunch of Tibetan monks, right? They served the others, but they were trained to make good decisions. What Scott isn't, or what the defenders of democracy are not doing, yes, it would be wonderful if democracy worked like that. If we sat around and listening to the wise and the well-versed in these things debate these points and make decisions. But that's not what happens in a democracy. A vote is taken based upon self-interest of groups, right? And that's what decides what's going on, not reason, not wisdom, not the inherited wisdom of the ages. And that's why Washington made his appeal, ironically, to the religious nature of the American people. Don't forget your religion. Because if you forget your religion and you let democracy decide what's right and wrong, you're just turning it over to the masses. You're just going to make bad decisions, as they did in that state.